Ruthless, unwavering, possessed with an iron fist and a killer instinct. Ever since coming to power in May 2000, Vladimir Putin has silenced almost every voice of dissension in Russia and beyond. He took on the all-powerful oligarchs and won the day. He's waged wars, invaded neighboring countries, rode roughshod over international law, annexed great swathes of the former Soviet Union, and threatened NATO and its allies with nuclear warheads. If any of his critics gained prominence, they invariably met with a grisly and mysterious end. Put quite simply, Putin has swept aside everyone and everything before him. Back in June of 2023, however, the Russian leader faced what many believe was the biggest challenge of his 20-year-plus reign in the Kremlin. That challenge came in the shape of one of his closest former allies, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Worse still for Putin, this man was head of the Wagner Group, a mercenary guerrilla army that had gained such a fearsome reputation across the world that the UK government, among other prominent nations, considered it to be a highly dangerous terrorist organization. Fiercely critical of Russia's handling of the war in Ukraine, there was talk of Prigozhin staging a sensational coup, descending on Moscow and removing Putin from office altogether. Openly rebelling against the Russian military leadership, Wagner forces captured Rostov-on-Don and advanced towards the capital. How close that operation came to being a reality we will probably never know. The rebellion was called off a day later when the criminal charges being prepared against Prigozhin were dropped in Moscow. 2 months later, on August 23rd to be exact, Prigozhin died in a plane crash. An accident? A coincidence? Again, we'll probably never know. Some sources suggest there was a bomb aboard the plane or some other form of sabotage, even if the official line was that the plane suffered engine failure. What cannot be argued is that another of Putin's political opponents, perhaps one of the only true genuine threats to his power, had met the same grisly and mysterious end as so many others. But what does this tell us about the Russian leader's state of mind? Many political commentators have seen a change in Putin's demeanor ever since he launched his special military operation in Ukraine. Frustrated as much by Western intervention and the huge military aid packages delivered to Kyiv as his own tactical blunders on the ground and air, he has cut an increasingly confrontational figure. In interviews, his rhetoric was defiant, incendiary, and dangerous. Whoever tries to hinder us will suffer consequences you have never seen in your history. Back in February 2024, one of his most high-profile political opponents, Alexei Navalny, was found dead in a prison cell in Siberia. And remember, Navalny had already survived an alleged assassination attempt, poisoning with a nerve agent back in 2020. Back then, Navalny had been investigating state corruption and the destination of billions of dollars in public funds. It was Navalny and his allies who leaked information to the press regarding Putin's palace, a lavish Black Sea hideaway, and details about his personal wealth. In some circles, the Russian leader has been dubbed the richest man in the world. Shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, Navalny was sentenced to 9 years in prison, a period many of his supporters claimed was effectively a life sentence for a series of dubious, trumped-up charges. But that's not all. In addition to the 9 years served after the invasion, Navalny was sentenced to another 19 years back in 2023. 2 years after the initial sentence, his death was reported to a stunned global press. Another accident, another coincidence, or just another example of the cold, calculated killer instinct that Putin has displayed ever since he came to power? Those are the questions that we will try to answer in this video. Whether the current conflict has exposed that killer instinct, or whether it's something that the former KGB spy displayed from the moment he first set his sights on the Kremlin. To gain a better insight into the mind of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, we have to travel back to St. Petersburg, or Leningrad as it was called, of 1941. Why? After all, Putin wasn't born until a decade later. Well, as the historians amongst you know, the city was subject to a brutal 872-day siege by Nazi military forces, constantly bombarded and suffering from such an acute lack of supplies that some of the populace either died of hunger or resorted to cannibalism. The city's courage and determination to survive were nothing short of astonishing. In all, an estimated 1.5 million people died as a result of the siege, and what some military historians consider an act of genocide. But why is this important? It's important because it tells us exactly the environment a young Vladimir Putin was exposed to when he was growing up. The survivors of the siege, Putin's close family and friends, no doubt told the boy about the heroism and painful suffering the Leningraders overcame. It's no coincidence that to this very day, he still lays an annual memorial wreath to those who perished during the siege. A year after Putin's birth, the all-powerful Soviet General Secretary Joseph Stalin died. Even though Putin was probably still swaddling clothes at the time, this was another hugely important milestone date in his life. In his formative years, Putin, even though his mother was a devout Orthodox Christian, was no doubt indoctrinated with stories about Stalin's glorious past. And it was from these seeds that Putin grew into the leader the world knows today. Over the years, his unlikely rise to power has been so well documented that it's probably already well known to viewers of this video. In 1975, Putin graduated from Leningrad State University. Later that year, he joined the KGB on a probationary basis. Tellingly, and perhaps this reveals much about Putin's romanticization of the Soviet regime, Putin loved a spy series that aired in Russia during the 1970s, 17 Moments of Spring. The main character, Stirlitz, has often been called the Russian James Bond. However, Putin's early role in the agency was far less exciting. According to former agent Oleg Kalugin, Putin was a low-level cog, a nobody, who spent his time harassing dissidents and ordinary citizens as well as hunting for spies, fruitlessly as it transpired. In 1985, Putin was transferred to Dresden to work as a spy. Posing as a translator, his duties were much the same as they had been in Leningrad. He was a low-level functionary in every sense of the word. But despite his unspectacular beginnings, he steadily rose through the Secret Service ranks. In 1990, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and the year previous had been awarded a bronze medal for outstanding service to the East German National People's Army. After the collapse of communism and the reunification of Germany, Putin returned to what was now known as St. Petersburg and took his first steps in politics. Initially in an advisory capacity to his former professor and newly elected mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. From 1994 to 96, Sobchak acted as a mentor for his ambitious student of old. In 1997, Putin moved to Moscow and was named Deputy Chief of Staff to new leader Boris Yeltsin. Within 2 years, Yeltsin promoted Putin to the role of Prime Minister. From there, he never once looked back. Many would cite the fall of the Soviet Union as another key moment in the development of Putin's character. Remember, he had grown up listening to the stories about the heroism of his countrymen and women during the Second World War. Ideologically, he saw the West as an evil empire intent on destroying communism and taking over the world. It makes perfect sense that Putin's life ambition was to restore Russia to its former Stalinist-era glory. But at this stage of his political career, even those close to Putin could never envision the kind of indelible mark the man would make, and will no doubt continue to make, on Russian life. Back then, most prominent political figures and the emerging oligarchs who'd prospered following the fall of communism perceived him as a yes man, a mere puppet, someone they could easily mold to their will. But history was shortly to prove that that was far from the case. It was during the mid to late 90s that the more uncompromising side of the man was exposed, most notably in the way he dealt with unrest in the Caucasus region and what many saw as the catastrophic war in Chechnya. As mentioned at the top of the video, he took on the oligarchs and won, either driving them out of the country altogether or having them exiled in Siberian prisons. His treatment of Mikhail Khodorkovsky was particularly brutal, even if Khodorkovsky lived to tell the tale. At one time, the former oil tycoon was the richest man in Russia. After the fall of communism in 1991, he made a fortune trading in foreign currency and commodities. However, his biggest success involved the acquisition of assets formerly owned by the Soviet government. In 1995, his company Menatep acquired Yukos, Russia's second-largest oil company, in a privatization auction for around $310 million. Khodorkovsky became one of the handful of men who prospered to such a degree during the post-Soviet period, he was in effect in control of some of the country's most valuable natural resources. At first, Putin appeared to cozy up to the oligarchs. It wasn't done out of admiration or camaraderie, but, to paraphrase a quote from the mafioso classic The Godfather, a case of keeping your friends close and your enemies closer. In July 2000, not long after Putin had come to power, he took his first steps to curb the oligarchs' power. The main thrust of his new policy appeared reasonable enough. He would allow the oligarchs free rein in their respective industries as long as they stayed out of politics. Only Khodorkovsky didn't listen. He and all of those who made themselves almost impossibly wealthy during the fall of the Soviet Union weren't prepared to sink into the background. He rejected Putin's proposal and spent millions shoring up opposition to the Russian government and promoting legislation that was beneficial to his business interests. A foolish move. 3 years later, Khodorkovsky was arrested on charges of fraud and tax evasion. In 2005, he was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 9 years in prison, later reduced to 8 years. Just before he would have been eligible for parole in 2007, additional charges of embezzlement and money laundering were brought against Khodorkovsky. The message, Vladimir Putin is not a man to meddle with. Anyone who has attempted to cross him has rarely been afforded the luxury of living to regret it. All of which brings us back to Yevgeny Prigozhin. To return to the scenario we outlined at the top of the video, who was Prigozhin? How did he ascend to such a position of power in the Wagner Group? And why did he fall so spectacularly out of favor with Putin? Interestingly, Prigozhin was formerly known as Putin's chef. Why? He used to own restaurants and catering services that were regularly hired by the Kremlin. Like the Russian leader, Prigozhin was born in Leningrad to humble beginnings. His father was a mining engineer, his mother a nurse, and he was indoctrinated with tales of Soviet heroism. Prigozhin's grandfather was a captain in the Red Army during the Second World War and received a medal for courage following the Battle of Rzhev, a fact he was immensely proud of. So much so that he helped produce a film entitled Rzhev in 2020. At this point, the parallels between Putin and Prigozhin are obvious. Two men from the same city, a similar generation, Putin was 9 years senior, who eulogized the former Soviet Union and wanted to return it to its glory days. But how did their paths ultimately cross, and how did they become such close allies? This is not the most straightforward of questions to answer. Before he began his own unlikely rise to the summit of Russian political life, Prigozhin had what can only be described as a shady background, to say the least. In 1979, he was caught stealing and was given a suspended sentence of 2 years and 6 months in prison. He served his sentence working at the chemical plant in Veliky Novgorod. A year later, he returned to Leningrad, joined a street gang, and went on an unprecedented burglary spree in the city. In 1981, he was sentenced to 13 years imprisonment in a high-security penal colony for robbery, theft, fraud, and involving minors in criminal activity. A far cry from a catering magnate serving champagne at lavish Kremlin functions. By all accounts, Prigozhin violated the terms of his solitary confinement and was eventually sent to general population in 1985, where he worked as a lathe operator, tractor driver, and cabinet maker. In 1988, the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union reduced his sentence to 10 years for good behavior, was sent to a medium-security penal colony, and was finally released in 1990. For more than a decade, Prigozhin had spent time mostly in and out of Soviet correctional facilities. It's a fact he would later use to convince dangerous prisoners or former convicts to join the Wagner Group. But Prigozhin most certainly had the entrepreneurial spirit that would see him flourish during the 90s. From selling hot dogs in an open-air market in Leningrad, he built up what would become the city's first supermarket chain, Contrast. During this period, he became involved in the gambling business before diversifying into construction, marketing research, and foreign trade industries. It was around this time that he first made the acquaintance of an ambitious young politician called Vladimir Putin. In 1995, with some of his business ventures rumored to be struggling, Prigozhin opened his first restaurant in St. Petersburg, Old Customs House. It was a huge success, and a second restaurant quickly followed 2 years later. How exactly his relationship with Putin developed isn't altogether clear. By 2001, however, Prigozhin was personally serving the new Russian leader and French President Jacques Chirac when they dined at one of his restaurants. The rest, as they say, is history, a curious, murky, and mysterious version of history, as was so much of what happened during the early years of Putin's tenure as leader. Fast forward just over a decade to 2012, and Prigozhin's now blossoming catering giant Concord received a contract to supply meals to the Russian military worth $1.2 billion over 1 year. Very much in line with the axiom, it's not what you know, but who you know, the lucrative state catering contracts continued to roll in. In December 2018, a company affiliated with Concord Catering, although the links were strenuously denied at the time, was paid 2.5 million rubles for an annual Heroes of the Fatherland Day banquet held at the Kremlin. A year later, the company received another 4.1 million rubles for another banquet. Prigozhin's star was clearly on the rise. And it was at this point that his activities came to the attention of a committed anti-corruption official by the name of Alexei Navalny. His anti-corruption federation accused Prigozhin of not only corrupt business practices, but of supplying some of Russia's schools with such poor quality food that it led to a serious outbreak of dysentery. In 2022, Prigozhin was awarded the dubious honor of being dubbed Russia's most corrupt man of the year by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Quite how Prigozhin leaped from catering mogul to the head of a state-funded private military group is not altogether clear. What is easily explainable is that he certainly had the background and credentials. After all, he spent a large part of his early life behind bars and no doubt had connections with the criminal underworld. It wasn't until 2022 and the invasion of Ukraine that he openly affiliated himself with the organization. Regularly pictured armed and in military garb on the front line, he told the watching world that he had personally set up the Wagner Group to protect Russia after the genocide of the Donbass region began. As intimated, Prigozhin was personally responsible for recruiting soldiers to the group, very successfully. Their numbers swelled from a few thousand fighters in 2017 to over 50,000 at the beginning of the conflict with Ukraine, a significant fighting force that those in the Kremlin would clearly have wanted to remain loyal to their cause. However, it quickly became obvious that not only was Prigozhin unhappy with the way the war in Ukraine was being fought, but that he might have his own political agenda, something you can never, ever do if you want to stay on the right side of Putin. In a series of incendiary videos posted on social media around the world, he expressed his anger and dissatisfaction, culminating in an outright denunciation of the Russian government following the disastrous battle for Kharkiv. Make no mistake, Putin now had a very dangerous and volatile problem on his hands, in the shape of a rogue and increasingly powerful military organization he himself had funded. And it was perhaps at this moment that his killer instinct came to the fore once again. When Prigozhin's forces assumed power of Rostov-on-Don and set their sights firmly on Moscow, there was only one conceivable outcome: the smoking wreckage of a plane crash site with the name Yevgeny Prigozhin among the list of passengers aboard. Another of Putin's enemies died, and it's unlikely to be the last in a long line of high-profile victims. In fact, whenever Putin has faced a crisis during his time in power, whether minor or major, one of his most vocal critics has invariably been, to borrow a term from the Stalinist vernacular, removed from the scene. Anna Politkovskaya was hugely critical of Putin's handling of the war in Chechnya. The outcome? The award-winning journalist was gunned down outside her apartment building. Physician and liberal governor of Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, Boris Nemtsov, found dead with a bullet in his back outside the Kremlin walls. Organized crime opponent Alexander Litvinenko poisoned with polonium in London. Former political ally and one of his first oligarchs, Boris Berezovsky, found dead in his home in the British countryside, an incident which the coroner ruled an open verdict. All of which brings to mind Putin's boyhood hero Stieglitz, the Russian James Bond, licensed to kill. But like so much about Russia, past, present, and into an increasingly uncertain future, there are still far more questions than answers whenever we dig deep into the mind of Vladimir Putin. After over 2 decades in power, and no matter how much is written about him, he is still seen as a mysterious, beguiling figure on the world stage. But what's next for arguably the most powerful man on the planet? In the aftermath of his recent landslide election victory, securing him a 5th term in office, one thing is certain: Putin is not going anywhere soon. If rumors coming out of Russia are to be believed, he may well have altered the country's constitution, in effect enabling himself to lead until his death. Worryingly, it now looks as if the war in Ukraine will rage for many years to come. According to one particularly pessimistic political commentator, maybe even as long as 5 to 7 years. The capture of the key strategic city of Avdiivka and the fact that military aid from the West isn't flowing as freely to Kyiv as it was at the start of the conflict seems to back those claims. No matter what the time frame, if Putin is ultimately victorious in Ukraine, he may well set his sights on open conflict with NATO and its allies, even if he's played this threat down in recent weeks. But if there's one thing we've learned about Putin since he rose to power, it's that he has never played by the same rules and is prepared to do anything to achieve his long-term political aims. In that respect, he is far more akin to ruthless dictator Joseph Stalin than to open glasnost-era Mikhail Gorbachev. Unshackled by the rule of law and the democratic institutions of most Western countries, Putin has free rein to act in whatever way he sees fit. If his ultimate aim is to restore Russia's borders before the fall of the Soviet Union, then even his sternest critic couldn't argue that he is well on his way to fulfilling that aim. But it is perhaps a famous story about Putin's childhood in Leningrad that shines a light on his psyche more than anything else we've discussed in this video so far. As legend would have it, the young Vladimir Vladimirovich inadvertently came across a rat in the basement of his family's apartment building. Cornered and desperate, the rodent leaped up and made a lunge for the young boy's throat. Ultimately, Putin dodged the rat's assault and suffered no injuries, but it was something that always stuck in his mind. When put in an impossible situation, only the most extreme actions will enable you to extricate yourself from your predicament. For a vast nation that has a history of invasion, from Genghis Khan to Adolf Hitler, it's a lesson in life that Putin has most certainly learned from. Now the video's coming to an end, it's time to ask for your views on Putin's killer instinct. Do you think the Russian leader is a dangerous megalomaniac who would stop at nothing to achieve his political ambitions? Or do you think the image painted of him in the West is distorted, an exaggeration, and, like any other leader, he is merely protecting his own country's best interests, at home and abroad? And what of the bigger picture? Do you think Putin will be satisfied if he achieves victory in Ukraine? Or do you think he has his sights set on military confrontation with NATO or the US? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Russia's intel officer defects and reveals major problems for Russia. Or click this other video instead.